Good morning, everybody. Actually, I really enjoyed Portia's session, and I think following on from Portia's session, I've had an interesting year. So I've spent the first part of my career in e-commerce at the Home Retail Group in quite an agile environment, although I didn't know that it was agile at the time. More recently, I don't know who I am now, but I've gone back into enterprise IT. And it's really interesting to understand from a business point of view the challenges that leadership are having with understanding what Agile is and understanding how to apply it. And actually, we talked a lot in that session around hope and individual hope. What I've actually found is if people don't really understand the purpose of what they're doing, if people don't know how success is being measured, then it's difficult to turn that hope into success for the organisation. And so what I'm going to talk about today is purpose, the importance of purpose in an organisation. A lot of people have said to me, how do we know Agile's successful? And I've kind of turned that question around and said, how do we know that the company is successful? Forget Agile for a little bit. Agile is a set of values and principles that we all believe are important, but actually how does the organisation know, how does the team know that it's being successful? And so we're going to start to talk around the link between measurement and behaviour. So actually we understand the purpose of what we're doing, we understand how we're measuring success, but actually that measurement has an impact on the behaviour of individuals, teams and the organisation as a whole. I wanted to start with a story around measurement and mindset and behaviour. I was lucky enough a couple of years ago to visit the Toyota plant in Derby, and as you would expect, anyone that's read about the Toyota production system around lean, it's very impressive from an efficiency point of view. They do a lot of Kaizen, continuous improvement activity, and there's a really strong mindset. That was all very interesting, but it's the stuff that we'd read in books. It was good to see it happening. The bit I found really interesting was actually talking through an example of Kaizen, an example of customer focus. The company, when they launched the new Auris model, all of the measures that they had internally from a production line point of view were showing that they were building quality cars out to the market, and the throughput that they were looking for was optimum. But they were getting feedback from some car magazines that the customer satisfaction levels were dropping. And they really didn't understand why. All of their internal measures were positive, things were improving. And when they dug into it a little bit more, there was build quality concerns, which again, they really didn't understand why on earth is this happening. Everything we're measuring internally is positive. And so they spoke to some of the publications, spoke to some customers, and it was something to do with rattling in the new model. There was some sort of rattle going on that was knocking people's confidence in the build quality of the car. But again, all of the data that Toyota had didn't point to any sort of problem. They did sample test cars, so a small number of cars as they come off the production line, they take them around a test track. And that's normally to twist the chassis, to check for spot welding problems. They hadn't really noticed any sort of rattle, but Toyota didn't leave it there. What they did was they said, right, we need to get the data. Customers are telling us that there's a problem, and so there is a problem. And so what they did was they encouraged everyone on the production line to take it in turns for several weeks to take hundreds of cars out onto the test track. And they did get a small amount of data that was saying there was some sort of rattle. They found it on, I think they call it the Roman road, but like the Belgian cobbles. And so they had something. There was definitely a rattle going on. And again, after several days of testing cars on the Roman road, they figured out that it was the air vents, definitely coming from the air vents. Now, as part of the Toyota production line, they don't manufacture all of their parts from scratch. They assemble on the production line. Lots of those parts are coming in just in time from suppliers. And so they engaged their supplier for the air vents to say, customers are telling us there's a problem. And the really great thing was, there was engagement with the vendor that there's a customer issue that we have to fix together. I've worked in some organisations where we're standing behind contracts. Again, our data and your data say there's no problem, so there's no problem. Customers are telling us there's an issue with build quality, and so they work together with that vendor on a quick fix. So they put some padding around the fixings when they fitted it into the car on the production line. But at the same time, the vendor was investing money in their own manufacturing process to make sure that that issue wasn't there in the cars. Toyota being Toyota, this is actually what they put into the end of their production line. So it was waste having to drive the cars out onto the test track. So they actually built their own Roman road, the cobbles, at the end of the production line. So they were just coming off the production line straight into the test. and they were seeing that error rate then drop and eventually completely disappear. So it's just a really interesting example of customer focus, of finding data, and really everybody being bought into the fact that it's all about the customer experience, the customer value. And whilst our own internal data wasn't showing that there was a problem, there was. And so they went out and they got that data. That was the best thing I took from that trip. So this is something I hear a lot. Let's go Agile. So Agile is an interesting thing. I think as we talked about already, it's a set of values and principles. In talking to senior leadership and board members, this is kind of what they're trying to deal with in their minds. Everybody talks around systems thinking, lean, agile, changes in leadership, disruptive innovation. On the periphery, we've got holacracy, management 3.0 and teal organisations. Again, fantastic objectives, but I think you start to lose senior leadership when we start talking around, in these very hierarchical traditional organisations, we start talking around the team managing their own performance. It steps towards these things. And management are trying to grab onto something tangible, which is where Scrum and sprints and velocity and things come in. That's that tangible thing. We've all seen the Agile Manifesto. Some of the things I'm starting to see in particular are people don't like Gantt charts and plans. And so I'm certainly in an organisation now where we've got IT doing waterfall and e-commerce doing Agile, and they don't really know how to talk to each other anymore because one doesn't want to do any documentation and one still has a governance process. So that's been an interesting, we have to work together to improve each other, is important. The customer collaboration, again, is another interesting one because a lot of the user stories I now see have acceptance criteria like this. We're still writing a contract for our developers to deliver. We're not really working together. That promise of a conversation is missing in some teams. Another interesting thing is Agile is quicker and cheaper. This is another one I've had numerous conversations about. I have had some heated exchanges with some of my directors because we're actually seen as slowing things down because we're trying to validate that we're doing the right thing. All they see is Agile means features quicker to production. And actually we're trying to validate that it's the right feature. And more importantly, once we do put it in front of customers, we're trying to iterate. And that's a really careful thing to manage because it's not minimum viable, on we go, because we haven't really changed the behaviour of our leadership teams. Agile is not just an excuse to go quicker and cheaper. There's certain behaviours that we're trying to encourage around customer focus. I hear a lot that perfect is the enemy of the good. I understand that, but different people have different opinions of what good is. And yeah, as I said, that minimum viable product is starting to be abused a little bit, and it just means get the minimum out and then we move on. And again, it's about teams having trust that we're able to iterate. It's a learning experience. And are we truly creating that environment for our teams? Again, to the Agile principles, it's the highest priority to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery. So I keep showing this one. It's early, but it's continuous. It's not just get something out quickly because we're Agile. It's that whole point of we don't really know that what we're building is going to have the desired effect, so we have to iterate. Again, we talk around building projects around motivated individuals. So it's just going through with our teams and with our managers. Are we actually doing these things? We can talk about going Agile, but let's go back to the values and the principles. Are we actually trusting our teams? The trust word I've used a few times with my director, and it's a really interesting one. I had this conversation of why should I trust you because you're not delivering? I said, well, what does delivering mean to you? And he's, accountability is getting these features out by a certain date, and you fail to do that. So I think we're at different points because we almost have to give trust to allow the teams the freedom to do great things. And if you don't trust and you haven't given them that freedom, then it's an interesting conversation. Trust is really an interesting word in business. And simplicity. So again, going back to the minimum viable product, going back to simplicity, just back to what's the minimum that we can do in order to validate something. Just go back to minimum marketable features, minimum viable product. Just sit down with people and talk through what does it mean to you? Because again, minimum marketable features in our organisation means something different to my previous organisation. So quantifying these things. Don't assume that people know things that you know. Clarify what is meant by certain terms. Scrum's an interesting one. We've stopped talking about Scrum. We're actually moving a little bit more towards Kanban, but that's a different conversation. But even when we're talking about Scrum, let's not talk about sprints and story points. Let's talk about the reasons why we do it. We want small autonomous collaborative teams co-located. We want iterative development, not incremental development, and we want a change in leadership. And so we've stopped talking about Scrum, and we're just trying to make sure that our teams have got these things available to them. A little bit of history. A lot of what we're working to change in big organisations that have been around for many, many years is Frederick Taylor's command and control management. It made an awful lot of sense in manufacturing 100 years ago, but actually in those days it was a repeatable process. There was this view that you just get a different manager to shout louder and the teams would just produce faster. You could give people the big cash bonuses and they would do better. And we're really not in that place anymore. Those people that haven't read around Williams Edwards Deming, really, really interesting guy. He then actually went on in the 70s, took his ethos of a change in mindset towards management, a change in mindset towards teams, the plan, do, check, act, this concept of iteration and continuous improvement. He took that to start the lean movement and then to work with Toyota on what we know as the Toyota production system. But even back in the 50s, Deming is talking about purpose. He's talking about doing right by your customer and doing right by your employees. So this has been around for a long, long time, and this is still what we're trying to achieve. Companies say they're customer focused, but I would certainly question based on what they're measuring as success. We all know around the Agile software development and the manifesto. If anybody hasn't read around Mary and Tom Poppendike, again, really, really interesting. They try to take the ethos of customer value and waste removal and bring that into the software domain. So they've actually got, Lean talks about Muda, Mary and Tom talk about defects and other such things. But again, that's really, really interesting to try and bring Lean into the context of software development. And more recently, Lean Startup. So again, the Eric Ries book, fascinating. That's taken us on another step. So this kind of ethos of learning, continuous experimentation, having a hypothesis, this kind of movement of it's actually a learning experience. We truly don't know the solution at the beginning, so we need to learn together. So rather than starting with the solution, which is often agile, actually start with the problem. Particularly in retail, we talk about this a lot. A lot of retailers, either ones that I'm working in or ones that I will work with, are going to go out of business. And that's terrifying. It's a big number. We hear that technology is accelerating, new methodologies, new frameworks coming in all the time, and new companies forming all the time. The barrier to entry now to form a new company and to take market share is sort of tens of thousands of pounds rather than millions. So there's lots of new companies forming, lots of startups. I quite like the story of the burning platform. So it talks about it's more exciting to run towards something than away from something. The burning platform story is a guy is alone on an oil rig, wakes up in the night, hears a loud explosion, goes up on deck, huge fire. He has a choice. Does he jump into the freezing ocean or does he try and stay and fight the fire? And he jumps. He luckily is rescued by a boat that's seen the fire just before he dies through pneumonia. And when asked why he jumped, it was he'd rather face probable death than certain death. And the message behind this story for leadership is that you need to move from fear to ambition. Again, the organisations I've worked with in the last 12 months, there is this constant fear of we're losing market share, we're losing customers. And trying to motivate people in a place of fear is very, very difficult. These companies need to move to ambition. What's our purpose? Who is our customer? What are we doing for our customers? And that is often lacking. So the why. Nietzsche once said, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. So this purpose. Simon Sinek talks about, see it's happened, the golden circle, starting with the why, because that's where the motivation is. So whether it's you individually, whether it's your team, whether it's your organisation, do we understand why we're doing the things we're doing? Because that really is truly where the motivation comes from. Daniel Pink's book Drive, really, really interesting book. He talks around intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And again, because we're in a creative world now, it's not a repeatable process. The experiments that were run is giving people a bigger cash incentive and expecting them to perform better. They actually perform worse. His work was around intrinsic motivation, and he boiled it down to purpose, autonomy, and mastery. And again, I question, how much are we actually doing this in our organisations with our teams? Do we really explain, as a company, the reasons why we exist? Do we know, based on that our teams are able to make decisions that affect their work? And are people actually getting better? Are we encouraging personal development? Or is it still just about the throughput of work? Another interesting definition I saw was what is an organisation? typically when people talk about organisations, they talk about org charts, so the way that we're arranged. There is actually another definition out there that talks about grouping people with a particular purpose. So again, a group of people together understanding a purpose, why they're doing what they're doing, as a way of being successful. Purpose, we also talk about missions. It's interesting connotations with the army. So the army might have individual missions in Afghanistan, but they understand the purpose of being there, to make the country a better place, a safer place. And it's this kind of sense of you can go out on missions, but do you understand the higher purpose of what we're doing? You might be on a project that has a particular goal, but again, the importance of this higher purpose. He's fallen off the screen, but David Packard talked about this. The very fact that purpose can never be fully realised. So again, your company's purpose should be a real stretch thing we may never hit. You're always going to be changing and stimulating progress. There was one company whose name I forget, who they made plastic piping for cisterns, for toilets, but they wanted to make the environment better. And actually, from a innovation point of view, that actually led them to investigate this lofty goal of could you flush a toilet with no water? It wasn't really achievable, but they started to question everything that they did, and they actually started to use water used for washing your hands as the water to flush the toilet. Yeah, it's that way around. And that was, but it stimulated their innovation because their grander purpose was to make the environment better, not just be better at producing plastic pipes. I find the Airbnb and Uber examples very interesting because everybody always talks about the apps. We want an app like Uber. I've heard that numerous times. What's interesting about Airbnb and Uber is the ethos of the founders, but more importantly, the problem they were trying to solve, the business model. The technology allowed them to produce something that can be used by the masses, but actually Airbnb, two guys in America that couldn't pay their rent and they were going to be evicted from their flat, and just decided if they put an advert out that somebody could use their flat for a couple of days, would somebody do it? Yes, they would. They then started to push the boundaries of, well, that was quite profitable for us. If we ask other people, our friends, would they do that? And, again, people thought it was weird to invite strangers into your house, but it's changing behaviour, it's solving a problem through technology. And as I say, we focus on the technology too much rather than understanding the problem that was actually solved. So behaviour, I'll skip measurement for a minute. Agile is just common sense. I get that a lot as well, which is good. If people think Agile is common sense, that means that they align with the values and the principles. But we're actually hiring for training, fostering and measuring common sense. Do we understand what it actually is? We talk a lot about mindset. Mindset is defined as a set of assumptions and methods held by groups of people, creating this powerful incentive within groups to accept behaviours. So mindset and behaviour and attitudes all closely aligned. So are we making sure when we're recruiting, we're getting people with the right attitudes, mindset, behaviours, because it will impact the group if we don't. It's really important to have a strong relationship with HR or our people teams so that we do understand what we mean by mindset. People talk a lot around we need to get people that are creative and problem solvers. Do we really test for that as part of the interviewing process? Or is it just a stereotypical competency-based conversation? We need to make sure that we're getting the right people in so that they feel valued and we get good value out of them. Again, I have done this previously in my career. Are we promoting people internally to management positions and to leadership positions because we don't want to lose them? And that's the only real way to get them a pay rise. Are we setting them up for success? Have they had the right training to be a manager and a leader? Again, they're two very different things. Or are we not? Because most people that leave organisations, they resign from their manager, not the organisation. And so we need to be setting ourselves up for success, not just our teams, but our managers and our leaders as well. So again, the culture of any organisation is shaped by the worst behaviour we're willing to tolerate. This is another interesting one to bear in mind. If people aren't performing in the way we would expect, are we talking to them about that? When I've had people in my teams that perhaps aren't performing as we would expect, often it's due to self-awareness. People don't really understand that their behaviour impacts other people. So often it's having that very human conversation to say, when you did this particular thing or you spoke in this particular way, do you understand the impact that you had on other people? And in most cases that does work. People, not everybody can become self-aware, but at least have that conversation around the impact that people have on those around them. Eli Goldratt has spoken a lot around the theory of constraints, but one thing he did say was tell me how you measure me and I'll tell you how I behave. So this direct link between measurement and behaviour, which is a really, really interesting one. I spoke to one organisation around the key measure of success for their company and their division, and it was revenue per head. Now, he was a senior manager in IT, and realistically it's a terrible, terrible measure for them, but that was what they were measured on. And being in a place where they were doing a little bit of innovation, they were trying to change some of their legacy systems, they weren't really impacting revenue per head, and it was seen as a very detrimental thing. And in a typical organisation, you would then start to question the amount of staff that we have, the amount of funding we give to that department. It's a really negative set of conversations. Their solution to that, at least in the short term, was to lay off half their permanent staff and bring in contractors, because only permanent staff were counted towards the revenue per head. So they were still getting the same throughput of work, but they were doubling their revenue per head. Not the behaviour they wanted, but that's the measure they were given. The carrot and stick's quite an interesting one. Working for most of my career in retail, when we work with vendors, particularly around e-commerce, we set an SLA of 99.9% availability, and if we don't hit it, we then penalise the vendor in some way, shape or form. It pales into significance the actual sales that we lost and the impact on the customer. But again, can we turn that conversation round? Can we talk with our vendors about, there's a minimum expectation that we have, it might be 95% availability, but if you can get close to 100%, we will give you far more than we ever talked about. Try and give them an incentive to provide a better experience for our customers, rather than just penalising if we don't perform in the way we expect. Just trying to change that conversation. There's a lot of good work at the moment around Agile contracts, which is worth a read. It's a very complex area, but it's trying to change the behaviour that we have with our vendors. There was an airline that, and again, fuel is the biggest expense for an airline, and they need to save fuel, fluctuating cost of oil. But again, if pilots are told they're measured on saving fuel, they behave how they're measured. When they're on the tarmac, they switch the aircon off, even if it's a very warm country they're in, and they will find ways to avoid headwind. There will be longer flights. So customers are going to become frustrated. There's nothing in here that's focused on customer. People will behave how they're measured. I've sat in a lot of, sorry, I don't mean to be very frustrated. I'm sharing some realities, particularly in some of the bigger enterprise organisations. I've sat in lots of meetings on a Monday morning where we talk about these big vanity numbers. In a trading meeting, our revenues will be down, our hits per second will be down. And with these huge numbers, these huge vanity numbers, I don't really know how that relates to my team, my product, and the success of what we're doing. There's an interesting book around lean analytics. And lean analytics talks about measurement of movement towards goals. The interesting bit is, how would you react? I ask this question a lot. Somebody sets a key performance indicator. The minute you set that, consider behaviour, but also think about if that goes up or down, would you have any idea why? Would you know where to look? Again, I've been sent off for days at a time to investigate why a number's gone down, because we've shown that number to a director and we haven't known why it's gone up or down. And they've obviously look for the red and the green, and it becomes a long-winded investigation. So when you're thinking about metrics, make sure that they're understandable, but understand the behaviour change. You can't always predict it, but think about behaviour. What behaviour are you going to create? Velocity is an interesting one. In my current organisation, we are trying to educate them away from velocity. The throughput, the velocity is seen as a measure of progress, and we are comparing teams, which is really, really unhealthy. In one of the documents that we've been given today, it talked about the Spotify squad health check, and this is something I've used before. Turn that conversation around. If you're going to compare teams, at least do it based on an ethos of continuous improvement, of impediments. Talk to a team about where they think they can improve, where there's organisational impediments that you can help solve if you're in a Scrum Master or a coaching position. So try and change that behaviour. And Portia alluded to the diet and weight example earlier. I always find it's an interesting one to talk people through. When people get on the scales at the end of the week and they haven't lost the weight they're trying to lose, it's a lagging measure. You can't control it really. It's important. You might be trying to lose weight and that's your goal, but you need to think about the leading measures. What is it in the food that you're consuming, the amount of calories, the type of protein, carbohydrates, and the exercises that you're doing. That's the things you're in control of. What type of exercise do you do? How often do you do it? Maybe weigh yourself more often rather than wait to the end of the week. But these leading measures in your organisation, they're the important things. That's going to affect what your teams do and how they do it. The lagging is still important, but you can't control it. The other interesting one is a lot of the organisation I'm in at the moment, we talk about the importance of on-time delivery. So we've promised our customers a product by a certain time, and we need to keep to that promise. What we actually noticed was that's a lagging measure. Our leading measures is more the maintenance of the vehicles themselves. A lot of the times that we actually fail to deliver on time, yes, it's sometimes due to traffic, sometimes due to product availability, but often it's due to a breakdown of the vehicles themselves, far too often. And so actually our leading measures become the maintenance that goes on for those vehicles. Again, you wouldn't think about that at the start, but that's actually a thing we focused on. If we can improve the performance and the maintenance of our vehicles, they're less likely to break down, we're more likely to achieve on-time delivery. Someone told me something the other day, again, that was quite interesting. In marine biology, they were working with a team, is it still seismology if it's volcanoes? I think it is. But they were working with a team that were trying to predict when volcanoes would erupt. And actually what they've spotted is a pattern of behaviour in marine life. Several days before the volcano erupts, the marine life will move away, which again has been really interesting. All the technology that goes into trying to monitor the volcano itself, they've actually noticed a behaviour in marine life, which is again is a really interesting one. So it's trying to understand the cause and effect between things. Working closely with finance, this is something I've become really, really interested in. Again, working in a big enterprise organisation, when we talk to finance, we talk about capitalisation, we talk about investment, and we always talk about investment in certainty. We're coming from a world where we don't have certainty. We know the outcome that we'd like. We have a vague idea of what we might like to invest, but we can't guarantee that we're going to reach that outcome. We certainly can't guarantee the things that we're going to build and when we're going to build them. We also see people spending budget to get budget. Again, I used to work in a team where we'd be given a budget for the year, but then if we didn't spend it, we wouldn't get the same amount next year, we'd get less. And so think about the behaviour. People are going to spend that money because they know they need more next year. Have that open and honest conversation. This importance of transparency, the importance of, we may try something and it doesn't work. Let's have that conversation with finance because it is the reality. Let's not pretend or mask it. We've invested £100,000 in something where we were looking to invest £1 million and we've stopped. We validated that it was a bad idea and the market wouldn't be open to the feature. So you've actually saved yourself £900,000. Spin the behaviour round. We've not wasted money. We've avoided spending money that perhaps wouldn't have been successful. We've started to have a conversation with finance that's not about velocity and story points. It's important to speak in the language of finance. We understand from a product point of view, for the outcome that we want, strategically how it aligns with our objectives, whether we're increasing revenue, avoiding costs, it's risk or regulatory, and that's good. That allows the product teams to prioritise. From a financial point of view, understand something like the cost of delay. I really like cost of delay divided by duration. So we're starting to normalise some of the changes that we're making. Can we balance things not just on one number, but a series of numbers? We're aligned strategically. We understand potentially the payback. This is really easy in Agile because we have an Agile team that's working together focused on the outcome. And so you have 10 people in your team, you have a fixed cost, you have a fixed investment. And so the conversation is just about the payback. What KPIs we're measuring as success and what's the value of doing that? How does that balance? And you can have a sensible conversation that says, let's invest for 12 weeks, treat it like a startup. Let's invest for 12 weeks, see if we can reach the KPIs. Let's talk every week. And if we're not generating the value we expected, do we know why? If we don't, let's stop. Rather than go and get a huge budget for a huge project and then realise in the very end that you're not going to achieve the outcome that you expected. We can still have all the similar conversations around working days effort, total man days. If it's important, we can work it out. We know who's in the team, we know what they're doing, we know how long they're doing it for. So it's understanding with your audience the numbers that you need to produce to have that common conversation. And as I say, working in velocity and points and burn downs, we've really struggled for people to understand what we're doing. So it's understanding you may need to translate the data that you have to have that conversation with finance.
One quick question on cost of delay.
Yeah.
Is it something that you expect a Scrum Master or CTO to lead, or is it something, because I'm ex-Scrum Master and I'm CTO, and when I try to talk about cost of delay to the CFO, her eyes just glaze and she seem to think, her metric is pounds per point. She divides the number of points we deliver in different teams, and I can't bother to argue with her anymore because I know it's meaningless. But cost delay is something I've thought about before, but I'd like to try again.
And this is why it's important. It's off the screen, but you've got cost per sprint and cost per point. It's there. I don't want to talk about it, and it depends who's looking for what.
Yeah.
Because they're going to talk to you about what have you invested, how much is new features. So actually, if you're prototyping, and I've had this really interesting conversation, if you're doing a prototype or you're doing research, that is operational expenditure. They don't want that, but we have to do it. So it's having that honest conversation. How much capital investment are we looking for? If it's 60%, then you need to be doing 60% of stories in your backlog, trying to translate it. But you're right, if we shouldn't be talking about cost per point, but it's in there as the output. It's not leading what we're doing. But cost of delay, it's an interesting one. If we can understand the value of moving a certain KPI, we know how the amount of time we spend is always the tricky bit. But it's trying to balance all of these data points together, not just focusing on one thing. So questioning her, could she have 2 or 3 measures that are important to her, not just one? The depreciation of assets is another interesting conversation. So again, when you capitalise an investment, you used to buy loads of printers in the past, and you would depreciate that investment over 5 years. Now we're saying we've built something in an agile way, we've put it out to market, and we need to iterate on it. If that feature is deemed not successful and you take it out of the customer experience, then you technically have to write off that asset. And you have these really interesting conversations with finance, because you have to have these conversations. It's an open conversation that says, we're delivering something that's hopefully going to have a material difference on our business, but it might not. And you have to have these investment conversations as you go along. There's no point pretending that changing our login experience is going to have a material difference on our business for 2 years or 5 years. You might just decide to say, look, it's 6 months. But you need to change your internal finance policies to make that conversation palatable. It is a really interesting area. I think Agile and finance need to speak a similar language and have a more open and transparent conversation. The company I'm in at the moment, to a certain extent, we've got a very, very big budget that's protecting us from some of these conversations. And I'm going in and nudging and saying to finance, look, this is actually what we're doing. What do you think? Just trying to start the conversation in this sort of way. So just quickly move on to onto leadership. So David Marquet is also mentioned in the booklet we've been given. Intent-based leadership is another interesting thing. Something else I've noticed is leadership get a little bit lost now, because we're giving autonomy to our teams, we're giving trust to our teams are happy, our KPIs are all moving in the right direction. Don't know what I do now. To me, that's amazing as a leader. You've got a happy team, a successful business, go and play golf. That's great. Just, it's that servant leadership mindset of, I'm there when my team need me to help, but I'm also leading the organisation. We're giving direction. People know how success is measured. The David Marquet story is an interesting one, because, and I have worked with some teams where they're trained for compliance. Sometimes where the agile mindset clashes internally is somebody says, I need you to do this for me. And you say, why? Because we need to. I've been told by the owners it needs to be done by next Friday. Why? Do we know how we're measuring success? What's the experiment? What's the hypothesis? We're just not talking the same language. And the interesting thing about David Marquet, and why I encourage people to read this book, is it talks about him as a leader. He was just used to giving the right orders to have success. It was all up to him. He knew the ship inside and out. He could give the right order and they would be successful. He moves to a new ship that he doesn't understand. He has to trust the teams. He can give direction, but they have to be down in the engine room. Whatever problems they have, they need to solve as a team. He can help them, but he can't do everything for them. And that's what's really interesting. We keep saying to our board of directors, get out of the engine room. Who's steering the ship? It makes them smile, but it's that analogy. If we're all, everybody likes something tangible, but if we're all in the detail, who's actually steering the ship? Where are we going? Why are we going there? It's really, really important. Encouraging leaders to do that for us. I believe this was a Henrik Nieberg in the context of Spotify diagram, but this is another great one I like to show. I'm in a place at the moment where we're being given lots of autonomy, which is great, but we haven't really got a strategy. We haven't really got a vision for the organisation, and so we end up in this place there. I hope someone's working on the river problem. So one of our leaders will come over and go, "Who's working on the river problem?" So there's a problem with the river. Didn't even know we had anything to do with rivers. It's a really silly conversation, because that is then, and this is a common thing I'm now starting to see, we're agile, the teams have autonomy, the backlog is up to them. If the organisation doesn't have a view on its vision and have a clear set of strategic objectives, then people are going to start to get frustrated. You will have people come along that say, this is a fundamental problem that we need to fix. Someone else will come along and say, this is a fundamental thing that we need to do to compete with our competitors. And then you end up with all these clashing priorities, no way to prioritise. And there's initiative after initiative after initiative. And everyone starts to say, well, I thought Agile was supposed to make us go quicker. But when you've got too many things to do, however Agile or lean you are, there's only so much that you can have in the system. And if you don't understand your priority and you don't understand the capacity of your system, you're in big trouble. And so it's this importance of strategic objective, which will then allow your teams to prioritise. It's not just about your teams having autonomy to deliver, it's about them having control over what they deliver because they understand priority. So this statement I absolutely agree with. Vision without execution is hallucination. What I'm starting to find now is execution without vision is just placing random bets, and I'm seeing this an awful lot. So we don't have a vision, we just are able to execute. And you'll get lucky with some projects and features, and you'll be unlucky with others. So Peter Drucker also once said you can't manage what you cannot measure. We took that up a level and said you cannot measure what you cannot describe. So not just the KPIs, it's the objectives behind those KPIs. So I'm just going to quickly take you through something called the balanced scorecard, and I'll share all the links afterwards. The thing with the balanced scorecard is we needed our leadership to understand that there was a problem to solve. So we surveyed them on why would we do something like the balanced scorecard? What's the point? And there was a view, actually, we were good at executing, good at working together as a team, but it wasn't really related to our strategy. We'd have an off-site every year. We'd go and have croissants and biscuits and coffee, which was great, and it'd be a shot in the arm from a motivation point of view. But then we go back to our desks, work on our projects, and we really understand how that related to all the documentation we'd just been given. It was the MD's yearly thing to produce this motivational pack, but didn't really relate to what we were doing. So we looked at this. Let's be clear on our vision and strategy, but let's use the balanced scorecard, these 4 perspectives. Let's understand not just financially, not just from our customer, but also internally, from a business process point of view, what do we want to excel at? And from a learning and growth point of view, from an innovation point of view, the things that we want to do. Start to form objectives around those. This is an example of objectives and measures. In the company I'm in at the moment, we need to survive. And so cash flow and return on investment is crucial. But that's done in the context of other things. So, we need to consolidate our preferred suppliers. We need to improve our technical capability. We need improvements in productivity. So it's just trying to, this is probably too many objectives, but you need to start somewhere. Understand the things objectively for the business that are important, and every piece of work that you undertake, you prioritise in accordance with this. If it doesn't align to these objectives, then you shouldn't be doing it at the moment. Give yourself some target improvements. So these measures, how much do you want to improve them by? And then talk about initiatives. Don't start with the program or the project or the initiative. Start with the objective, know how you're going to measure success, target an improvement, and then talk about the initiatives that might help you with that. This is a strategy map. So this starts to put into context. If you're an Agile coach or in the learning development team, your job might be to enhance knowledge sharing and understanding of the organisation and competitors. So your job in your team is to run a training session on tools and techniques for understanding the competitor landscape. But actually, how does that relate to increasing shareholder value? I know that that's the most important thing we're doing. And so you try and give people motivation through saying, well, if all of the teams know how to run a competitor and marketplace analysis, they're going to develop new products and services that are going to improve client satisfaction, improve our brand, mean that we're growing revenue through the new services, and shareholders are going to be happier. Trying to give people this cause and effect relationship between the objectives that they're focused on and the broader organisation. Again, from an airline point of view, if ground crews are aligned from a training point of view, we're going to turn around quicker, flights are going to be on time. If flights are on time, customers are going to be happier. So again, it's bearing in mind the cause and effect, how we're measuring success, targets. It's clear to everybody in the organisation what success is. The example I'm doing at the moment, I didn't necessarily get complete buy-in from my leadership team that this was a good thing to do. So we didn't start from scratch. What we've had to do is reverse engineer the strategic objectives and the measures to show them something to say, and hopefully what they've started to say is, well, these aren't right. Good. If they're not right, what is right? Because actually this is based on the perception of the teams. All the teams that we've spoken to, these are the objectives that they think we have and the measures that they've got. Far too many, and leadership disagree that these are the right ones. That's a good place to start. Let's start having that conversation. Is what is important to the organisation? so that people can then start to prioritise their work. From an ideas point of view, we then want to get to a place where anyone around the organisation can have an idea, but we can start to understand. We know our initiatives because we know our objectives and we know our measures of success. And so anybody really in the organisation can say, well, that idea is aligned to an initiative already. It might be new and we know it's aligned to a particular objective, giving everybody that confidence that they can prioritise things. I'll share this afterwards. Google has done objectives and key results. It's a very similar thing, very similar objective, but a different execution. I'll share that as well. But again, in the context of anybody in the organisation can understand that what they do is important and they can prioritise. Just to show you really, the Hoshin Cannery. So this again, from decades ago, is from Toyota. And this is why we all talk about in the lean community Toyota so much. Read the Toyota Way if you've not read it, because there is some great stuff that Toyota did that is applicable. We may have changed the words, but the ethos of what we're doing is still the same. Toyota understood objectively what they were trying to achieve, and they understood the measures of success, and it's visible to everybody from a strategy point of view. So just quickly to finish, the things on the left we talk about a lot. Things on the right we don't talk about so much, but these are the important things. To get people to act in the right way, to embrace the right behaviours, we need to show that we're committed. And so if we talk in an Agile community around the T-shape of skills, are we actually doing that in our organisation? Are we encouraging people to learn new things so that they have this T-shape? We can't just talk about failure and cross-skilling as things and then grumble when they don't happen. Everybody needs to be embracing these things as important. The organisation needs to be measuring itself that actually cross-skilling is key to the success of the organisation. Because if it's not, it won't be important. It'll be one person in one department trying to do something that they feel is important, but it's not aligned to what the company's trying to do. Just talk through some of these things with your managers, with your leaders, and if they're important, show the organisation they're important by measuring them. So, just to finish, tell me how you'll measure me, and I'll tell you how I behave. Really start to think in your organisation, do you understand the measures of success? And do you understand the potential impact, good or bad, that they're having on the behaviour of your teams? And is it encouraging the right behaviour? Thank you. Sorry, that was a long final 5 minutes. Any questions?
You talked about trying to get people to think about not knowing where they're going and experimenting and moving initiatives. I work in a large organisation as well. The problem I often face is people are damned that they know what the answer is already. And so you end up having fixed objectives to work to, even though we might be operating in an agile manner as we think we are and iterating.
Yep.
There's always a fixed thing, and so you're always measured on are we getting there and when are we going to get there? We struggle with that. Have you had any experience with a similar situation?
I think it's just been in a situation where we all acknowledge you can't fix time, cost and scope. If you're fixing time, and other things are variable, and that's great. If we have to do something by a certain date, we can't be an Agile community saying we don't do dates anymore, because you lose everybody. If we can say there's an opportunity to do something as an organisation in 3 months' time, then it's our job to figure out, is that realistic? And be speaking every week about the work that we're doing and movement towards that outcome. And you have to understand the scope has to be variable. But we have to balance what's the minimum thing that we can put live. But it's also about saying to the leadership, if that's the date and we all understand it, we just have to present risks. We could put this live, but the quality's not right, the customer experience isn't right, and just talk in terms of risks and cost, and let's not talk about the Scrum principles and things necessarily. Let's start having that conversation that leadership's going to understand. There's a risk here, there's a cost here. Most people, it's our organisation, it's our customer experience. We're not going to want to put something live that's not right. I've just come out of a project that's deemed a failure because we didn't hit the date. We've gone live 3 weeks late. But it's the right thing we've put into production and it works. So it's that mindset you're trying to change of what success is. Success is hitting these KPIs. It's not dates. Yeah. Okay. Thanks everyone. Thank you.